Is the American dream still attainable in today's world? A recent Wall Street Journal article reveals a new perspective. Many voters feel that this dream is slipping away. You're listening to Investing Mastermind Podcast. I'm Signe and
And I'm Michelle Markey.
If the American dream is truly slipping away, what does that mean for investors and the society as a broad concept? Though I'm in Europe, we Europeans are still impacted by the United States and growth of the US. So for us, the American dream, it's something that we definitely can relate to, and many of us outside the US is also aspiring to. So what do you think, Michelle, in the US? Is the American dream getting out of reach?
That's what it can sometimes feel like with how housing costs have skyrocketed, and there have been a bunch of articles and people talking about how with, say, home mortgage rates being as high as they are, that makes a lot of home affordability very difficult to attain for many Americans. So it can feel like sometimes if the definition of American dream is to have all the things that you see in the movies, like have a house, have a family, have a car or two, and have all of the modern luxuries we enjoy, like streaming TV and all the video game consoles and all the gadgetry anyone could wish to have. It seems like, if you want to have all those things, it could appear as if it's becoming harder to attain. But let's talk about it. Let's see, kind of picking through some areas, what is really sensible and what, is just social media making something out to be worse than it really is.
After we talked about this in a previous podcast, we actually did talk a little bit about the American dream and a book you read. I came across, an article on Bloomberg, and the share of Americans who are mortgage free is at an all-time high. But what it also says is that it's baby boomers who paid off their house loans. It says almost 40% of US homeowners own their homes outright as of 2022. That is a lot. 40% of US homeowners own their own house. That is actually quite a large percent of people who own their own house. That's quite amazing. What it does say here is that, it's baby boomers. They are, it says, snapping up or holding on to a larger share of homes overall. So what the article says is that the share of US homes that are mortgage free jumped 5 percentage points from 2012 to 2022. So yeah, it's quite amazing. But what does that mean for our generation, millennials, if the baby boomers own all the houses? That's an interesting thought.
There could be a few thoughts to this. So one, I bet that the majority of the people who do own their home outright are more likely to be baby boomers by now, because they've probably lived in the homes that they've lived in for the last 30 years. And even if they're empty nesters in this kind of environment, there's nowhere else to go, because if you were to sell your house now, you're going to have a high interest rate if you get another mortgage somewhere else, perhaps, unless you buy somewhere in just cash, which is possible too. But another possibility is, let's say you want to leave your house to your children someday. If they want to own it after you, that could be a question of a wealth effect coming to the next generation when, sadly, baby boomers might pass away someday, and then there will be estates that will pass on to the next generation. So things like that could be making people either happy that their parents own a home outright, or it could be a headache because once a parent does pass away and they pass on that house to the children, now they need to decide what are they going to do with it. And if you have more than one child, that could be a bit of a tricky situation about deciding how are you going to do something with the house or other assets your parents had. So are you going to sell the house? Or are you going to keep it? Which child is going to keep it? It's a lot of questions that people have to ask themselves. So that could be a double-edged sword. It could be great that people own their own home, but then you have to plan and figure out with your will, and like what Warren Buffett does, talk about your will with your children of what could happen if that day comes. So definitely something, a lot of questions and things to consider with people being able to own their own home. But maybe taking a step back to say the generation we tend to talk about the most, which is the millennial generation, because we're millennials. So in terms of what's important to us, I read in this Generations book by Jean Twenge that apparently millennials think we're super economically not doing well, that we might be broke, and that we can never achieve a house ownership. But in actuality, that's not super the case. It turns out that millennials have 48% home ownership, which is only 2 percentage points behind baby boomers who had 50% home ownership at the same age. So really, millennials think we're behind in terms of owning homes, but we're really not. It's really not as bad as a lot of the media might make it seem.
That's so interesting because, yeah, that's what you often read on the news, right? Is that young people, they can't get access to the market right now because prices are, first of all, homes are expensive, but also interest rates are high. And I want to say that when boomers bought their first houses, interest rates were even higher than we see today. In the 80s, they were insane, right? So, but usually what we see on the news, in papers, etc., is that it's more difficult to find an affordable house for our generation, and that we can't get into houses because of interest rates. Something that I reflected on recently was, when I was younger, it was kind of like that episode with Carrie in Sex and the City. When I was in my 20s, I definitely had more, my shoe closet was full of expensive shoes and bags and all that stuff. And my own financial situation wasn't that great at that time. And that's when I kind of looked in the mirror and decided this needed to change. And I was lucky that it happened to me when I was in my 20s, that I was able to turn things around completely at that time and realize that I'm not going to go very far with high debt and a closet full of amazing shoes and bags, but I need to start saving more. I need to actually start focusing on accumulating money instead of just spending them. So I do think that it's funny how, the perception definitely is that it's very difficult for our generations and for the younger generation to get a house when it might not be like that. So I actually think that's quite interesting data.
Other things I gathered from this book, which I'm holding up in our YouTube video version, the Generations book by Jean Twenge, is that contrary to what a lot of millennials also believe, like we think we're paying the most in terms of housing costs, but actually we're a little bit luckier than the previous generation, Gen X, that actually currently has higher housing costs. And you might wonder, why is that? And part of it's because the economy was doing really well in the earlier 2000s, like before the great financial crisis of 2007 through 9, Gen X actually had to pay more in housing costs on average leading up to that breaking point. So technically, if you were a millennial buying homes somewhat in the aftermath, like say in the early 2010s until pretty much the end of the 2010s, before the pandemic made a lot of things crazier, you were able to buy a house during a more depressed housing market timeframe compared to the Gen X. So as much as it can be difficult, and maybe it's difficult now for maybe younger millennials and also Gen Z who might be trying to buy a house, it could be really difficult now. So there was a period where it was somewhat better than what the Gen X people experienced. So it kind of goes in cycles. Like you could get super lucky with when you buy a house or just sort of unlucky, but that's just the way it kind of is. We have to make the best of our current situation. And, if you find a house that you like, in my opinion, I feel like you have to try to make do with what you have, like try to save as much as you can toward a down payment and try to pay off a mortgage in a time frame that makes sense to you and your financial situation. And maybe you can refinance later down the line to a lower interest rate, because who knows, if you don't go for a house now, there's no guarantee you will have the same house opportunity in 5 years. So I would not let that hold yourself back. Like if you need a house and you need a certain amount of bedrooms because you have a growing family, you got to do what makes sense and not just all squeeze like sardines into a tiny place.
Jumping to a bit of another thing, there's also been talk about this American wealth gap since COVID, where the richest 0.1% have gotten richer and the bottom 50%, they've also gotten richer, but not really compared to the richest percentage point of Americans. So the richest top 0.1% has 18 trillion available, while the bottom 50% of Americans have just around 3 trillion available. And it's the World Bank, it's statistics from the World Bank, and it's definitely a huge wealth gap since the pandemic, and quite an impact that the 1% has been able to turn around what happened during the pandemic, while the bottom is really suffering. It seems right now. It's not necessarily anything to do with generations that we're talking about, but definitely about the American dream.
And I mean, it'd be interesting to see how much like the younger generations, like us as millennials and Gen Z, how much we're able to recover, let's say, from this, because for a long time after the Great Recession, we thought we were really struggling, and we were, say, before the midpoint of the 2010s. And a lot of people were struggling. A lot of people's parents lost their homes and had foreclosures, and you could be seeing a wave of that coming, perhaps, like where the lower classes compared to the 1% could be experiencing a lot of hardship in the coming years, especially if the economy could take a turn for the worse. And then people might run out of the savings they had that were boosted by the stimulus checks that the American government gave to a lot of families. And you have to find a way to set up your family for success. I know it's very difficult, like it's easy to say, but harder to do. But there's definitely opportunities out there. Like we have to keep trying to find a way to assure that our own and our family's welfare is good for the future. And it's tough. Like I wonder what the stats might say now, but compared to previous generations, in 2018, the Federal Reserve came out with some stats that millennials had 34% less wealth than prior generations, and it had actually improved by 2019 to only being behind by 11%, but we were still behind in terms of wealth accumulation. So I wonder if that stat might get worse for millennials and maybe the Gen Z, if having some of the pandemic challenges might kind of hold us back, or if in spite of that, maybe we're able to have a boomerang effect, like just like what happened in the mid 2010s, where the economy started getting a lot better and people were able to somewhat catch up in generating higher incomes and so on. Like supposedly the millennial generation makes more income now compared to prior generations, which sounds good in theory, like we might make more money than prior generations. But on the flip side of that, are we able to retain that? So it's one thing to make income and make money, but are we able to effectively save and invest that money? And that's where I think the jury could still be out. And so it will be interesting to see in the coming years when psychologists and surveys come out with updated stats, how we're really making it through these difficult early 2020s.
Yeah, and I also think that we millennials, we need to have that long-term perspective. We're the generation that grew up right around the time where the internet started and started using the internet as the first, generation that was really on the internet. So for us, we started thinking short-term, and with short-term results, websites have to load really fast. We don't really have learned a whole lot of patience. I'm not saying it's only the internet's fault, but that's just where we need to stay patient. We need to, get used to social media and people that are posting that, now they're on vacation, now they got a new car and all of this, and just not aspire necessarily to that. But it's very difficult because we're right in that change of not being exposed to stuff like that and being exposed to like that. And younger generations have always been exposed to something like that and might be able to take a step back. So we just need to keep cool, think long term. And also when it comes to our homes and wealth, etc. And, what we can see also is that the American total household debt reaches 17 trillion in the third quarter of 2023, is what the Federal Reserve came out with. And a lot of that is mortgage, which it's not bad debt per se, but there's a lot of mortgage debt, a lot of student loans, a lot of auto loans, and just credit card debt went down right after the pandemic, people started being a little bit careful, but now it's just gone through the roof. It's 1 trillion. So, it's just something that we need to be mindful of staying focused on the long-term gains and not taking on credit card debt, which is sort of a short-term solution.
Yeah, that's a slippery slope. If you get into the habit of running a credit card balance and you don't get to pay your balance in full every month, you're paying a lot of interest for no reason, like 20 to 28% sometimes on your monthly purchases, that it's really detrimental if you want to build wealth for the long term. So unlike the time when Americans were able to build substantial wealth, like especially millennials between 2015 through 2019, it's possible that we could be going in reverse right now because there was a lot of demand and a lot of people needed things during the pandemic. But we have to try to be mindful about our spending habits and not get so comfortable with the sort of, sometimes easy gratification things that we could do, like getting food delivery and Amazon delivery. And there's a lot of short-termism, like what you're saying, and also just watching media content. Like all of us have grown accustomed to just instant gratification of, we want to watch what we want to watch, and all the streamers, and our attention spans have become way shorter with social media and like people just mindlessly scrolling. I think that phenomenon is called fubbing. So you're getting snubbed by someone being on their phone, and by people having that, like I could be having a conversation with one of my friends and then they'll just be like looking at their Instagram or TikTok, and I just kind of feel a little bit ignored. And I feel like we as a society owe more to each other, to be more in the moment, to kind of just appreciate each other's presence and not just have this gratification need to scroll on social media. So the more that we can distance ourselves from the addicting effects of social media, and that kind of changing how we behave can actually be really good for our pocketbook. So something to keep in mind, because one thing that a lot of people don't realize is the more that you're on social media, it's not good for your mental health. And you're probably more likely to buy things because you're letting advertisements influence you. And you're like, oh, this skin cream looks great, maybe I should buy it. And you're like, just being sucked into this capitalistic spending mindset that a lot of Americans have. So if you don't want to be like that, because you're listening to the Investing Mastermind podcast and you want to be more like Signe and I, you're going to be like, I'm smarter than the average person. I'm not going to get influenced by social media to buy stuff mindlessly.
I really want you guys to also follow Michelle on YouTube and social media, because I really admire you, Michelle, and your ability to be really conscious about your spending and your money. When we've met at the Berkshire meeting, we've discussed this, and I can just hear that you're really inspirational in the way that you think about money and about spending. And it's definitely worth all your listeners to just hop on YouTube and follow Michelle there, to also, get in close proximity to her and her money mindset. It's definitely worth it.
No, thank you for that, Signe. And I'm not necessarily trying to toot my own horn, but basically it harkens back to a lesson we've learned from Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, is to live within your means. So if you can live within your means, you will be more likely to pay off all your credit card expenses every month on time, in full. Or if you're even one of the more advanced people, like I know someone who, as soon as they buy something on their credit card, they pay it off immediately, which, they do it to collect the points and then they make sure to pay it off. I don't necessarily go by that because I would just be paying my credit card bills very frequently. But that's another option. If you don't want to get into this trap, you could maybe set up your bills to be automatically paid in full every month. And that way you don't have to fret about it. It could be made to be an easier process than people who, maybe they don't even keep track of what their credit card bills are until they're overdue on their payment. And then that's a really not great place. So I would suggest try to be more mindful and maybe keep a log, like I keep a spreadsheet or write in a journal of what your money habits may be like, and see if there's anything that you'd like to improve upon.
And there are apps out there as well that can track your spending. Like even my bank have an app where I can see which categories am I spending money, and I can track how much do I spend. And it's super helpful because when I was in my 20s, and maybe I shared the story before, but at that time we still had cash. And, when you have cash in your hand, you can see, okay, how much money do I actually have? And when you use a credit card, it's much more difficult. And we are a generation now that's, again, we don't have that transparency that cash gives us. So we need to be really mindful about credit card, and hopefully, Generation Alpha, which is, a couple of generations behind us, is going to be able to navigate this lack of transparency towards having that at hand cash and having digital cash instead. But use the apps, use a spreadsheet like Michelle to track your spending. It's not that difficult. And in the beginning, if you have a lot of debt right now, it's going to be difficult to look into your account. It's not going to be super fun. I've been through it myself. It's not fun, but at least you know the state of the nation and you can do something about it. And then it gets fun, because then you can start working towards it and you can see how your debt is going down month after month. So it can be fun to begin with. It's not fun, but at least you did it and you can pat yourself on the shoulder for taking responsibility.
The sooner that we can pay off our student loan debt, if we have any, and other kinds of debt, like especially credit card debt, like I'm in favor of paying off the highest interest rate accounts first. But other people like Dave Ramsey, he is more of a snowball effect, like get your small wins of paying off your smaller balances first before you tackle things with bigger balances, so you can feel good about yourself. So whichever way you want to approach it, there's no right or wrong way. It's all what's comfortable to you. And then I think the American dream is very achievable for all of us. Like I believe that if we can get a hold of our personal finances and get on a good track with investing, I think anything that we set our mind to is more than achievable. So I still have a belief in the American dream that I could someday achieve it. And I don't worry about, if people my age have fancy cars or fancy houses, that doesn't bother me. I don't compare myself to them and are like, oh, I wish I had that, whatever they have. Like, I don't need to be comparing myself. So I think the more that we can just reflect on our own capabilities and our own personal finance area and set goals for ourselves that are realistic, not unrealistic goals. Like, next year, I'm going to buy a $30 million house in Malibu. Like, that's just silly. Like, if you are coming from a relatively normal income and you're just thinking you're going to win the lottery and get a fancy house in Malibu, that might not be super realistic thinking. So we should set realistic goals and work towards achieving them. And ultimately, find ways to be happy that aren't dependent on how much money we have or don't have, is what I would kind of wrap up in saying.
Yeah, but also just, knowing your goals. There are so many people out there that don't have any financial goals and they just don't think about it. I think a lot of people might know a little bit about what they want, but they just have never said it out loud. So they don't know what the financial end goal is. If it's a house in Italy or, being financially independent, it's important to just reflect on that and then set a goal and just try to, it's not like you have to necessarily keep track of it all the time. There are many ways to set a goal, but just knowing what is the end goal for you, what is it that you want to achieve in terms of wealth, and just try to, write it down and just be aware of it. There's so many people that does not do that. So if you do that, you've done much more than anybody else. On that high point, I want to say thank you so much for listening to us. I hope this gave room for reflection for you as well. If you still believe that the American dream is achievable, I think Michelle and I both believe that it definitely is achievable and that we want to work towards that. So we are coming to an end of the show. Thank you for listening in, and we'll be back on Tuesday.
Till next time.
If you enjoyed the show and found the content informational, we would be super grateful if you would leave us a review and follow us wherever you get your podcasts so you automatically get new episodes in your feed. We publish a new show every Tuesday.
The contents of the Investing Mastermind podcast are for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. None of this is investing advice, and if you need help in your personal situation, please consult with a professional.